So there's not going to be any theory or technical theory in this presentation. It's very much going to be at the practitioner end. And what I'm going to do is take you through a recent case. It's the Royal Mail Whistl case. It's essentially an anti-competitive exclusion case, abuse of dominance. It's in the bulk mail sector, which is essentially business mail. That's the source of your bank bills and quite a lot of the junk mail that hits your doormat every morning. But it's a sizable activity. It's a 2 billion market, and it accounts for a large majority of letters that are posted. So why am I picking on this case? Well, first, anti-competitive exclusionary cases are controversial and they don't come along very often. And appeal judgments in particular don't come along very often, so they're always worth looking at. The overview is 2018, Royal Mail made a decision, Ofcom made a decision that Royal Mail had abused its dominant position. I'll come back to some of the details, but the basic point was they had set discriminatory prices against an emerging competitor. We found abuse of dominance. We fined £50 million. Royal Mail appealed. It went through a CAT hearing in the summer of 2019, and the judgment was published towards the end of last year. And I'm going to be talking about that judgment. But there's two further reasons why I picked this one out. Firstly, it really is a fascinating read, and by that I mean the CAT's judgment. It's engagingly written, and it has loads and loads of information, comments, descriptions about what an exclusionary practice looks like in the real world. There's discussion about how managements think about it, how they plan it, how they evaluate it, how they think about the costs, the benefits and risks, and how they implement it. So if you're if you have students in theoretical IO or specializing in econometrics, but from time to time they want to see the real world color of how it works, this judgment is a great place to start. It's all in there. And it's really good for practitioners as well. As well as these cases being rare, it does describe at some length the role of professional advisors, in particular economic consultants, when it comes to advising large companies on the competition implications of the strategies they may be thinking of. And that was actually part of the evidence, as I'll come back to. But the third reason is the one that's coming up in the title, which is this particular case goes right to the heart of one of the most controversial issues in the economics of abuse analysis. And in particular, it goes to the very vexed question of when should as efficient competitor tests or equally efficient operator concepts be deployed when you have allegations of exclusionary abuse. That issue has long been controversial. When I started in competition policy several decades ago, it was essentially treated as a fairly legal question. It used to be called form-based. For a very long period, economists have argued, and many lawyers have argued, that there needed to be far more weight placed on whether various types of discounts, and we are in the world of conditional pricing discounts here, whether one should look more at what the effects were expected to be. You know, were discounted prices really like to drive out rivals? Were dominant firms really likely to be able to recover the costs of such strategies? And the result of that has been a general acceptance now that effects play a key role in those cases. The outstanding question really is, what does an effects assessment look like? And in particular, to what extent should it be determinative whether or not the dominant firm can show it's passed what's called an as efficient competitor test, which varies according to case, but broadly means it can show that an equally efficient rival faced with the conduct alleged that the dominant firm would be able to make a profit and compete in the markets. And that question really was at the heart of the hearing. It was the main point of appeal by Royal Mail, and it's discussed very extensively in this judgment. So next slide, please. Sorry, yeah, apologies.
Can you see it?
Yeah, it's the in the round economics one, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so my structure is, first, I'm going to give Ofcom's perspective to you, and this is the one that contains all the discussion of what actually happened and why there was a competition effect here. And then secondly, I'm going to come back to the Royal Mail's argument, which was, in a nutshell, well, that's all fine, but Ofcom didn't do a as efficient competitor test, and it should have done. And if it had relied on that, it would have found a different answer. So essentially, this is what does an effects analysis look like when you aren't using an as efficient competitor test to drive. There was loads of evidence on the market, and I'm going to come back to some of the colour, but some of the key points that came out were these, and they're on the slides. In summary, this was not just any dominant firm, this was Royal Mail. And Royal Mail, in delivery of bulk mail, so the activity we're talking about is post people putting letters through doors, was overwhelmingly dominant, and effectively, it's not too much to say, it was a monopoly. There were no significant competitors. And Ofcom's evaluation was, well, in that situation, even if you have one competitor, even if it's considerably less efficient than Royal Mail, that's going to be a significant injection of competition. And that was the situation faced. And I'll come back to this in a second. So the context was, you have effectively a monopolist facing a threat of entry for the first time. The second point is about the conduct itself, and it is complex. It's a form of price discrimination, and I'll do my best briefly to describe what it was, but it does get into the entrails of access pricing quite quickly. But broadly speaking, what happened is the Royal Mail is required by regulation to allow other companies to access its delivery network, so that they can go to a bank and say, I'll collect your mail and then I'll charge you for that purpose, then I'll funnel it into the Royal Mail's delivery system network. And obviously Royal Mail levies a charge for that. And the essential nature of the conduct was, faced with a threat of entry, Royal Mail basically said, well, we're going to revisit our charges, and particularly where a firm is entering against us, and this is a slight oversimplification, we will set a price differential, a price surcharge against that firm that would not apply to the others. And Ofcom went through this, and again, I will come back to it briefly, but essentially concluded that this was a case where the dominant firm was setting its profit maximizing access price, or its monopoly access price, to people who just relied on the Royal Mail network and didn't try and enter, and then set a surcharge where you did try and enter. So it was essentially monopoly price plus surcharge, not price discounting. There was loads of evidence about the intention behind this strategy. There's lots of documents. I'm going to come back to those in a second. And there was an evaluation of what actually happens. What was the likely effect on the entrance? It was significant. And on the market facts, following the introduction of these charges, Whistl, the entrance, stopped its entry attempt and eventually exited completely as a delivery competitor. Next slide, please. So to give you a flavour of that dominance I described, here's the value chain. So what I've called retail, that's the bit where if you're Whistl or UK Mail in this country, you go to a bank and say, I'll collect your bills and I'll funnel them into the Royal Mail system and levy a charge for that. That is a competitive market. However, it is only 10% of the value chain. The vast majority of costs in post is in the delivery network. It's post people walking up and down the streets. And at the time of this conduct, essentially Royal Mail had a 98% share of that delivery activity. So super dominant. And moreover, why did it have that position? Well, it's not surprising. There are significant sunk costs in setting up as a delivery competitor. There are large economies of scale and scope. Once you have a post person walking past the house, they can deliver lots of letters, not just one. And Royal Mail was, absolutely the established incumbent with the brand and experience and reputation, plus some tax advantages. So that was the context. This is not normal dominance. This is close to monopoly with entry barriers. Next slide, please. So Whistl, for the first time in UK history, attempted to essentially leverage from its position as a significant, having lots of deals with various banks to collect their mail, to move deeper into the value chain and move into delivery. And the way they had to do this, or the only sensible way to do this, is to start off with some pilots, try setting up a delivery network in a few areas, and then expand. So you continue to roll out new geographic areas. And at the time of the conduct, where they had reached is they had done the pilots, they were ready to go. They had looked for external private equity investments, a firm called LDC. They got that all set up, and they had a plan to roll out over the next 4 years at that time to 40%, 2% of UK postcodes, mostly in urban and suburban areas. So as of, and we're talking about the late autumn 2013 here, they were all ready to go. And at that particular point in time, what happened next was the Royal Mail decided to announce its new pricing strategy. And that immediately led to the things being put on hold by Whistl. And as I said, they did eventually exit a couple of years later. Next slide, please. So a key part of the case and at the hearing was evidence on what Royal Mail was thinking when it set up this price differential. So why did it go down this route of changing its prices so that if you entered in delivery, you would pay higher prices? And there's some various comments about some of the legal questions here on the slide, but essentially the CAT concluded that while evidence of intent to exclude can of course never be determinative, and that exclusion is, or abuse is an objective context, it did say it was absolutely highly relevant. And it was particularly relevant in this case because that evidence was so strong. Amongst various observations made was when it comes to discriminatory pricing, often economists will jump to, well, hang on a minute, discriminatory pricing can often be very efficient, it can be sensible. How do I tell whether this is good or bad? If it's conditional discounts, how do I tell whether prices are going down or up? And all kinds of things that mean you can't just look at the form of activity and always reach a clear conclusion. But here, with the intent evidence, you could get to a much clearer view that essentially what we were looking at was basically a cost charge when you competed. And if we go back ahead 2 more slides, because I want to show you some of the evidence. So there was a large amount of documentary evidence in the Ofcom decision and presented at the trial, and also extensive cross-examination of both Royal Mail and Whistl executives. But just to give you a flavour of it, essentially what the CAT, what Ofcom had originally described in its decision, and what the CAT found and agreed with, was essentially when you looked at the development of this strategy, the development of this pricing approach, it was very clearly designed to essentially make Whistle's entries substantially less profitable, such that they would reconsider and cease. And that's all that it was designed for. So there was very little to suggest that it was for some other more benign purpose, such as efficient pricing, cost-related pricing, any of those things. And this is the sort of slides that illustrates this. And this is quite a nice slide, again, to show to economics students if they're not familiar with this kind of thing. But this is a slide from an internal Royal Mail management pack. It's in the Ofcom decision. And we call it the traffic light slide. And basically what this slide shows you is it's standard business evaluation. So what's happened here is Royal Mail's executives have gone through a variety of options on how they might respond to this threat of entry from Whistl. And without getting into the details, they've looked at, firstly, adopting this price differential, this price surcharge. They looked at that in combination with other arrangements, such as a lesser surcharge. There's a thing called a zonal tilt on the slide, which basically means increasing the degree to which there is geographic price differences to reflect differences in costs, and or even differences where basically to change the prices where they felt that Whistl was most likely to enter. And on the far left, 0, you may not be able to read it easily, is a do nothing option. Do nothing and wait for the market to develop without defending the USO. And essentially what this reflects is an evaluation of how each of those pricing arrangements would affect Whistl, what its likely reaction would be. And you can jump to the bottom row and you will find the line of market share loss and Royal Mail revenue loss. So what they've done here is they've said, okay, if we do nothing, that's the far left scenario 0, we expect by 2017 to be losing 9.4% of our share. So recall, it's the only competitor, so that still leaves Royal Mail as 90-10. And we will be facing an annual revenue loss as a consequence of 240 million, because recall, this is a big market. By contrast, hence the traffic light colouring, if you jump to scenario 2, which is a description of what the actual conduct they deployed was, they now are thinking, well, if we deploy a moderate price differential and also these changes to geographic pricing called the zonal tilt, we get a different answer. In this one, what's the likely outcome for the direct delivery operator? That's the penultimate row. It's switch to PP1 and stay there. And what that means is, in plain language, that Whistl ceases its entry and then gets the benefit of the cheaper pricing option that Royal Mail makes available. So that's the one where Whistl doesn't enter. Bottom row, there is still a tiny little bit of market share loss because the pricing plans would have allowed Whistl to continue with its sort of pilot entry, but far less. So now Royal Mail would retain a 98.6% market share by 2014, and the revenue loss is far less, 40 million a year. So some nice simple arithmetic there. I mean, we're talking, this is an exclusionary strategy where the payoff is somewhere between 120 and or more £1 million a year for Royal Mail. And next slide, please. There was a lot more like this. The next slide is essentially was in the slide pack. It's kind of going through some of the calculations that informs Royal Mail's evaluation of how far sorry, how Whistle's decision to enter or not might be affected. If we keep going. So again, a bit more flavour of what an internal management slide pack looks like. So essentially where Ofcom reached was, this is a monopolist. It has huge financial incentives to keep Whistl out. It essentially, you know, it did consider the possibility of cutting its price, even selectively on a geographic basis, to a greater extent than it actually did, as a way of meeting entry or preventing entry even. But that was expensive. It would have allowed for what they called revenue dilution. And the whole purpose of this exercise was to essentially exclude on the cheap, to keep Whistl out without having to compromise that revenue. They worked out the price differential would hopefully do the trick. They implemented it. You know, the other factors were certainly going on, but the direct effect is entry is suspended, Whistl left, you know, essentially job done. Subsequently, there has been no further attempt at entry in this activity. So now that we're about to come to the AECT, it's pretty textbook. You know, predation was feasible, credible, could be implemented, happened. So what was Royal Mail's answer to this? We go to the next slide. It was pretty much that Ofcom had not done a price cost test. So Royal Mail's principal argument on the appeal on this area anyway was basically, if you're a dominant firm and you can show that your conduct is such that if an equally efficient operator would be able to compete in the market profitably, no matter what the conduct, that's a safe harbor. So you're always okay. And Royal Mail hired some advisors. This was after they actually introduced the strategy, and the advisors did some calculations and they concluded that such a test would show that a equally efficient operator could indeed compete effectively with Royal Mail. And there was some interesting economic arguments put as to why that was a good test for a safe harbor. Essentially, they were there was elements of legal certainty, but also that it would prevent inefficient entry. So that was a good thing. And therefore, this case really is effectively an extreme case. This is the one where essentially the argument was pass, fail, and AECT really is the effects analysis. The rest doesn't matter. Next slide. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to dwell. There's various legal precedents and legal debates, but the essential finding of the CAP was there is no requirement in all pricing cases for the authority to undertake an AEC test. Extensive discussion of the Intel and post-Denmark cases at the hearing and in the judgments, if you're interested. And the next slide. There was, in addition to that, however, a lot of economic debate at the hearing, and it really did go to the heart of, well, why do you have AEC tests? What is their purpose and when should they be used? And to put the view that Ofcom put, and specifically me, essentially the observations we made were, or that I made, were that if you look back at where AECs came from, they were very sensible. They came from predation cases where, you know, when people used to scratch their heads and accept, well, low pricing, obviously that doesn't in itself look like conduct of a nature that's liable to foreclose markets, but very low prices could have anti-competitive effects. How do we draw a distinction between them? Well, we want to be really careful here because obviously low prices and competition on pricing is one of the primary objectives of competition policy. And the absolute last thing you want is to sort of artificially prevent dominant firms from setting low prices. And there's an obvious need for very clear rules. We don't want to have chilling of firms that aren't actively under investigation. And perhaps some broader observations that predation is really costly for dominant firms, especially monopolists. You know, they are earning those monopoly rents, and to give them up, even temporarily, costs a lot. So they don't tend to happen that much anyway. But the argument was, well, once you get past those areas, whereas, you know, the reasons why you want a hard and fast safe harbor like an AECT, it gets much, much trickier. Once you're into conditional pricing, and once it's certainly into a situation where that pricing is conditional on whether you compete in the core monopoly, things are a lot trickier. And the argument was, well, the trade-offs between low price and long-term competition are far less clear. In this case, an arrangement where the result of the response to entry is to increase prices, not cut them, you know, you lose that core observation that you're trying to keep normal competition on the merits going. Exclusion can be a lot cheaper, can be a lot more credible, and therefore it can be a lot more likely. And so the balance of errors looks very, very different. What did the CAT make of it? Well, they essentially concluded there's certainly no need to always have an AECT. Economics doesn't provide a very clear, bright line on when you should use them. They accepted that in this specific case, the conduct was a price surcharge, not a price cut, so it didn't fit in the low pricing paradigm. And there were some arguments, really quite interesting economic arguments on the sort of inefficient entry that said, well, it may be true that Whistl might have been less efficient than Royal Mail if it had come in, and that could have led to some duplication of fixed costs, which is one of the traditional things that concerns regulatory economists. But when you're facing a monopoly, and this is the only entrance, it's not the case, or it's fallacious to say that, well, higher duplication of fixed costs results in higher average costs, forces higher prices. The correct way of thinking about it is the other way around. Monopoly to duopoly, even if it's a small competitor, results in lower prices, lower volumes for the incumbent firm, and that's what results in the higher average costs. But in the process, you've delivered consumers their benefits, and the standard here is consumer welfare. So a key point was, when you've only got one potential competitor, even if they're less efficient, it's better to have competition from that less efficient competitor than outright monopoly. As long, of course, as you're not achieving it by artificially restricting the monopolist's ability to compete on the merits. I'm actually out of time, I realized. There were some further comments. I'll just say, if you just go on to the next slide very quickly. There was also some extended discussion about the actual AECT test that Royal Mail's advisors had done. I don't want to go into the details of that, but essentially the insight was, in a situation where you have a monopoly and an entrance that has a very different business model, that has substantial disadvantages compared to the incumbent, but also some advantages as well. The AECT really just doesn't help you inform anything about the impact of the conduct on entry, on the actual entrance. It becomes a very hypothetical exercise to just say, well, would a clone of Royal Mail be able to enter? Well, maybe, and maybe not actually. But the clone of Royal Mail is not the entrance here, so it just largely becomes a useless exercise for informing anything about actual effects in the market. Also, some various points about some of the details of the calculations, the usual things around common costs, etc. Lots of interesting stuff about Dixit, Pindic, and option values all started to fed into some scratching of heads as to what the answers being presented were, even on their own merits. I'm not going to dwell on that. So I'm out of my allotted time. That's a quick canter through. The material is fascinating, and I do encourage those interested in this area to read the judgment all the way through. And I'd be very happy to take any questions on any of the points raised, or indeed any other points that people might be familiar with about the case.